The transatlantic slave trade stands out in history due to its scale, duration, and brutal nature. It's also significant because of its lasting impact on the African diaspora, the development of the Americas, and the global economic system. If you are African or African American, we encourage you to stick through this video to learn the entire truth regarding the question of Africa's involvement in the slave trade. We will provide a historically and culturally accurate insight into this pertinent question. It was the distinguished Nigerian literary giant, Chinua Achebe, who said, "Until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter." It's essential for everyone to understand that in any aggressive scenario, the primary accountability lies with the instigator. We have consistently resisted across the continent, and it's time to dispel the notion that we are to blame in part for the slave trade. There were 150,000 Jews in Hitler's extermination plan, but no reasonable human being in this world would ever say that the Jews were responsible for their Holocaust. Let this sink in. Ultimately, only we, as Africans from both sides of the Atlantic and as victims, hold the right to document our history. As the renowned Mama Miriam Makeba once said, "We shouldn't expect those who invaded us to pen the truth about us." Recent conversations, amplified by several contemporary videos, including the one shown here, have emphasized Africa's role in the transatlantic slave trade. While navigating this intricate subject requires delicacy and depth, it's crucial to counter misrepresentations with factual accuracy rather than solely emotional responses. Forms of slavery existed on the African continent before the transatlantic slave trade. Let's examine this statement. While it's accurate to state that forms of servitude and bondage have existed across different cultures and epochs, it's crucial to distinguish between the various systems and understand them and differentiate them from the barbaric European slave trade. Ancient societies, including Egypt and Carthage, had forms of servitude, but these systems were often different from the chattel slavery associated with the transatlantic slave trade. For instance, in ancient Egypt, many workers on monumental projects weren't slaves in the sense we think of today but were peasants working as part of a taxed labor system. We have covered the topic of this erroneous impression of slaves building the pyramids in Egypt. See the video description for a detailed historical narrative. Next, it's true that the Trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean slave trades predated European involvement on the continent. However, these trades were distinct in nature, scale, and impact from the transatlantic trade. Additionally, the numbers provided, while significant, are estimates, and the exact numbers are still debated among historians. Slavery in the Islamic world was diverse, encompassing a range of roles from household servants to high-ranking officials. The claim about widespread castration needs careful contextualization. While castration did occur in some instances, it wasn't universally practiced across the entire Islamic world. We have uncovered the impact of the Islamic slave trade in a separate video. While it's accurate that various forms of servitude were present in West Africa before European contact, the context provided needs to be examined critically. The Ghana Empire, existing between the 4th to 13th centuries, derived its wealth primarily from gold and controlled trade routes linking the southern gold-producing areas with Saharan trade centers. While it had forms of servitude, it's an oversimplification to attribute its prosperity mainly to the trans-Saharan slave trade or slave labor. While the Mali Empire did have slaves, attributing the extraction of all its salt, copper, and gold to slave labor is a sweeping statement. Notably, the famous Mansa Musa's wealth largely stemmed from the vast gold reserves of the empire. There were indeed slaves in various capacities, but there were also free laborers, artisans, and miners. Empires, by nature, expand through conquest. However, to portray the majority of slaves being acquired through subjugation of weaker entities simplifies the diverse mechanisms through which people became slaves, including debt, crime, or even voluntary submission in times of famine. Songhai, Joliffe, and Kaba did inherit certain socioeconomic structures, but each had its unique approach to governance, economy, and even slavery. Blanket statements risk obfuscating these differences. It's indeed accurate that slavery took various forms in West Africa, from agricultural to military roles. The ability of some slaves to own land or potentially buy their freedom underscores the difference between West African servitude and the chattel slavery of the European-dominated Atlantic system. The statement about Benin's ritual sacrifices does reflect specific historical instances. However, it should be understood within the broader religious and ceremonial practices of the time. European powers didn't encounter a blank slate but complex societies with established norms, institutions, and practices. However, the European involvement in the Atlantic slave trade massively escalated the scale and brutality of slavery. Africans were not passive victims. An interesting proclamation that needs to be scrutinized. The narrative surrounding the transatlantic slave trade, as it's often presented, predominantly casts Europeans as the sole architects of this devastating chapter in history. In truth, the African experience during this period was multidimensional. While millions of Africans tragically found themselves shackled and sold as chattel, others, within certain African kingdoms and regions, engaged in and benefited from the trade. These African groups, driven by their own economic, political, and interregional rivalries, sometimes collaborated with European slave traders. However, it's paramount to contextualize this collaboration. European powers, armed with advanced weaponry and maritime capabilities, frequently manipulated local rivalries, instigated conflicts, and applied direct and indirect pressures to gain advantage. So, while it's accurate that not all Africans were passive victims, a comprehensive understanding necessitates recognizing the layered power dynamics and external influences at play during the transatlantic slave trade. We would like to draw your attention to the prevailing situation in Africa at the present time. Puppet leaders planted by neo-colonialist Western nations are still in power today. Cheap resources are still being carted out of Africa, while a vast majority of our people remain economically disadvantaged. The same tactics are still being used by the descendants of these colonizers. The video titled Exposing Africa's Part in the Slave Trade sought to establish African kings as willing participants in the trade. We will address a few bold claims made by the author of that video. The notion that African kingdoms primarily sought European alliances for firearms and sold captives for status symbols slightly misrepresents their motivations. African kingdoms had their political, economic, and military objectives, often more complex than just procuring European goods. King Alfonso I of Congo did indeed maintain a relationship with the Portuguese and was involved in the slave trade. What is left out of King Alfonso I's narrative is that his older brother Mpanzu Akidama, who was critical of Europeans and Christianity, attempted to expel the Portuguese out of his kingdom. However, the Portuguese plotted against him to support his brother, Nzinga Mbemba, who later became known as Alfonso I. We hope this gives viewers a better context of who this puppet king was to the people of Congo. The Portuguese slowly began dominating the Congo Empire, often ruling alongside the monarch. They aimed to technologically weaken the Congo, making it a vassal state. They hindered the Congo's ambitions for international trade, even denying them ships. The Portuguese also began controlling the empire's international relationships. This control paved the way for the slave trade, which Alfonso finally opposed after he recognized the sheer number and brutality of the trade. He was appalled at the participation of both the Congolese and Portuguese Christians in slave raids. Alfonso frequently wrote to King João III of Portugal, expressing his dismay and seeking intervention, only to be met with indifference. We covered the role of the Portuguese in undermining the Congo Empire in a recent video. Please see the video description. The broad assertion that African elites primarily saw Europeans as sources for firearms and status symbols requires a more multifaceted understanding. African leaders sought diplomatic, religious, and economic ties with Europe, not just arms and luxury goods. Claims about slavery among the Akan of modern-day Ghana. The Akan peoples originate from modern-day Ghana, not Nigeria. Furthermore, the Gold Coast is a colonial-era name for modern-day Ghana. This error already demonstrates a lack of precise understanding of West African geography and history by the author of the video titled Exposing Africa's Part in the Slave Trade. While the Akan region was rich in gold, it's an oversimplification to state that all mines were operated solely by slaves. The notion that a third of the Akan state's populations were enslaved, predominantly from non-Akan groups, needs robust evidence for verification. Typically, slaves were captured from adversaries during conflicts. The conditions under which Ashanti slaves lived could range from accumulating personal wealth and marrying into their master's family. Some slaves even had the ability to possess slaves of their own and could appeal for a change in masters if subjected to extreme cruelty. The mode of servitude practiced in Africa distinctly contrasts with European serfdom, or the various incarnations of slavery observed in other societies. Contemporary Ashantis assert that maltreatment of slaves was rare, and anyone found abusing a slave was viewed with disdain by the community. Besides slaves, there were also pawns. These free individuals were sold into servitude to settle debts. Around 1838, Asantehene Kwakudua I prohibited this pawnship system. Africa, being a continent of vast diversity, can't be reduced to a narrative of lacking African solidarity, since its various nations and kingdoms had their interests and shared histories. It's misleading to imply that age-old ethnic divides solely fueled the transatlantic slave trade, without considering the European influence in magnifying and transforming existing systems of bondage. The ethnic relationships in Africa evolved over time and weren't static, making the continent's history as dynamic as any other in the world. Lastly, European contact undeniably influenced African societies, challenging the notion that their arrival had minimal impact. This challenges the assertion made by the authors of this video, claiming ethnic divisions were not quickly changed by the arrival of Europeans to the shores of West Africa. Addressing the assertions about the Kingdom of Benin. Firstly, while it's accurate that the Kingdom of Benin is different from today's Benin Republic, describing it as a small territory in modern-day Nigeria is a reduction of its significance. The Kingdom of Benin was one of the most powerful and sophisticated states in pre-colonial West Africa, boasting of a rich history, culture, and a vast territorial influence. Regarding the Obas, kings of Benin, while Obiuera and subsequent rulers made conscious decisions regarding the transatlantic slave trade, it's crucial to understand the context. The kingdom's decisions were rooted in broader diplomatic, economic, and strategic concerns, not merely population strain. The differentiation between the transatlantic slave trade and domestic servitude is essential. Like many other global societies at the time, the Kingdom of Benin had its form of servitude. However, comparing domestic servitude to the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade might oversimplify the nature and scale of both. Also, while the Kingdom of Benin indeed had skirmishes with the British in the late 19th century, it's an oversimplification to suggest they primarily fought to uphold domestic slavery. State institutionalized slavery by the Dahomey. The narrative about Dahomey, while factually detailed, can unintentionally present the African perspective in a singular dimension, which warrants a more nuanced analysis. First, positioning Dahomey solely as a slaving power doesn't give due respect to its sophisticated administrative, military, and cultural systems. Like many civilizations, it adapted to prevailing economic drivers, in this case, the transatlantic slave trade, to ensure its dominance and survival. The massive standing army of Dahomey, while used for conquests and slave raids, was also a sign of centralized power and a deterrent against potential invasions. It's an oversimplification to suggest that a fear of rebellion was the primary reason Dahomey sought new conquests. This minimizes the complexities of statecraft and inter-kingdom dynamics of the era. Moreover, while slavery and its associated rituals were significant, it's essential to contextualize them within Dahomey's religious and socio-political framework rather than see them only through a Western lens. sacrifices, while brutal by today's standards, were practiced by many cultures historically and were tied to deeply held spiritual beliefs. The decline of Dahomey due to the cessation of the slave trade illustrates the tragic dependency some African states developed on this inhuman trade, due to European demand. However, this dependency was not unique to Dahomey. Many global economies were built on exploitative systems. To place an undue emphasis on Dahomey's commitment to the trade without adequately addressing the European demand and pressures that sustained it is to miss a significant part of the story. Colonization and the anti-slavery quest. The assertion that European colonization in Africa primarily stemmed from anti-slavery motivations can be misleading and obscures the multifaceted reasons behind European imperialism. While it is undeniable that European powers took action against slave trading in Africa, it is essential to frame these actions within broader imperialist ambitions. The European intervention was not purely altruistic. Economic, strategic, political, and even rivalries among European powers played a significant role in the scramble for Africa. The capture of Lagos and Benin by the British, for instance, should not be seen merely as a humanitarian mission. Lagos was strategically located, granting control over trade routes and potential resources. Similarly, the punitive expedition against Benin, while pegged to the massacre of a British delegation, also aimed at gaining control over valuable resources like palm oil, rubber, and ivory. Moreover, while some European powers abolished the transatlantic slave trade, their economic systems shifted to exploit African labor in other ways. Colonial powers implemented forced labor systems, cash crop economies, and exploitative taxation regimes that subjected Africans to severe hardships. The effects of which can still be felt today, especially in French-occupied regions in West Africa. France continues to siphon cheap resources out of French West Africa. The recent coups for liberation in some Francophone countries attest to this. Additionally, casting the African response as uniformly pro-slavery is again an oversimplification. As the video itself mentions, African abolitionists existed, and the continent's response to the slave trade and colonialism was diverse. Many Africans resisted both slavery and colonial rule, recognizing the exploitative nature of both. The narrative often neglects the fervent resistance displayed by Africans against colonial oppressors. The tales of Somalians, Kenyans, Tanzanians, and Mozambicans fiercely resisting the Portuguese for nearly a century, defending their cities and streets, witnessing their monarch's execution, and seeing their prosperous nations decimated by cannon fire remain untold. The relentless 40-year resistance of Queen Nzinga, who held off European advances in Angola, is rarely acknowledged. Few mention King Nzinga Mbemba's impassioned letters, pleading for an end to human trafficking. The story of King Badu Bansu of Ghana, who took down Dutch slave merchants before Europeans took his life, remains overshadowed. Similarly, King Almami of Senegambia's vow to eradicate every slaver on his land is often overlooked. The united front of the Soninkees and the Mandingos against European invaders is seldom discussed. Instead, a biased narrative persists, painting a picture of African leaders eagerly presenting their people with a label that read, "For sale," when Europeans arrived. In essence, to champion European powers as primarily anti-slavery saviors glosses over the broader implications of their imperial ambitions and the multifaceted reasons behind their actions in Africa. We are certainly not surprised by this blatant revisionist attempt to share the blame for slavery with its victims. This is a solemn reminder to people of African descent. Until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. If you appreciated this dive into the untold parts of African slavery, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more historical content like this.